As a parent, seeing your child in imminent danger is one of the most heart-stopping, panic-inducing scenarios you could ever be in. It also draws out a savage intensity, something eons old, buried deep inside. I want to write what happened while it's still fresh in my memory. This is what happened. I live in Westchester, PA. It's an ideal place to raise a family. The schools are generally very good, and there is no shortage of activities to do outside. My son is a little too young for sports. He's only 3, but he loves being outside more than anything else. A few days ago, we had an abnormally warm day for February, and being that I was off for the day and my wife was at her sister's house, I decided to take the opportunity and take my son for a long walk along one of the mild hiking trails nearby. I loaded up the stroller, grabbed some snacks and water, and took the 15-minute ride over to the trailhead. It's almost funny. You never imagine little decisions like this may be some of the last ones you make. It was a loop trail, and it usually only took me about 45 minutes to complete. But going with my son was a little different. There were going to be plenty of stops, and he liked to get out of the stroller every few minutes. In all, it was probably going to take us around 90 minutes. But I didn't mind. We didn't have much else to do. I guess we were halfway through when I started to notice something odd. Quick flashes out of the corner of my eyes, 2 or 3 times. It could have been a deer, but my son was pretty talkative that day, and they probably would have heard us coming from a ways off. I ignored it, and eventually we came to a little footbridge, crossing a small stream. We stopped and threw some rocks into the water and hung out for a minute. That's probably what saved us. The trail ahead was clear for a few hundred feet. For some instinctual reason, I suddenly glanced up from the stream below, and far ahead on the trail, something emerged from behind a copse of trees. It stood high on 2 legs. Even from a distance, I could see it was massive, covered head to toe in brown fur and 2 long dangling arms, almost reaching the ground. It had a wolfish jowl, narrow and elongated. It was too far to make out its eyes, but I could feel that it was staring at me. I had no idea what it was, and firmly grabbed my son, tossing him over one shoulder. I began to slowly walk away, pulling the stroller along with me, keeping my eyes on the creature. Once we were over the bridge, it dropped down to all 4s and began a slow prowl in our direction, matching our pace. My son had no idea what was happening and was struggling in my arms to get down. The growing fear in my chest made me accidentally over-tighten my grip, and he let out a half-shout, half-cry of surprise. At hearing that noise, the beast's ears shut up, and after a momentary pause, it burst into a loping sprint, heading directly for us. I abandoned the stroller and shifted my son so that I was carrying him like a football under my arm. I didn't get but a few yards when I threw a glance over my shoulder and saw the creature rapidly gaining on us. I knew that there was no way to outrun it. I believe if I was by myself, I likely would have become overcome with terror and froze up. Seeing a non-existent creature materialize from seemingly thin air and bounding toward you is probably too much for the modern psyche to cope with. But I wasn't alone, and I wasn't about to have the most precious thing in my life taken from me. My son was crying loudly now, feeling that something was wrong, but there was no time to be gentle. I dropped him to the ground and wheeled to face the approaching monstrosity. It was only a few dozen yards away, and I charged forward to meet it. It was on top of me in an instant, I was blown back to the earth, and the impact alone nearly knocked me out. But my son's shriek of terror enraged me, and I held on. Its claw was raking my left leg with incredible strength. The power of the creature well outmatched me. Its jaw was snapping right near my ear. I could hear the clack of its teeth each time. I kicked myself off the ground, rolling over to where I was on top. Both of its legs pushed me nearly off. I put my face into the scruff of the creature's neck and bit down, tasting dirt and almost gagging on the mouthful of hair. A clawed hand gripped my shirt from the back, tossing me to the ground. It was back on top of me immediately. I felt its jaw latch onto my left shoulder, but it was unaccompanied by any pain. I reached my right hand out, desperately grasping for anything. My son's shrieks of horror continued, and my aching heart dropped into the pit of my stomach. My hand found a half-buried rock the size of a fist. I ripped it from its earthen tomb and struck the creature in the head. Once, twice, 5 times, 10 times. I felt its grip loosen and struck again. I think I hit it in the eye, but it dropped my shoulder and let out a human-like bark of pain. I went on the attack and continued hammering blow after blow onto the creature. It had enough, and with another shriek of pain, leaped to its feet, running off the trail and into the forest. I was badly wounded, bleeding in several spots. I rushed over to my son, and he was completely fine. The adrenaline was fading now, and the combined blood loss was making me unsteady on my feet. I hustled my son over to a tree and leaned against it. I was almost to the point of blacking out, but somehow still had enough focus to undo my bootlace and tie my son's ankle to mine. I woke up in a hospital room. My wife was there with my son and her parents. I had passed out, but fortunately, another couple had happened upon us not too long afterward. They were able to get some help and keep my son safe until they arrived. God bless them. Overall, I was okay. I eventually ended up giving a statement to the police. Obviously, it sounded a little incredulous, but my wounds had come from somewhere, no doubt. They probably thought it was some kind of wolf or cougar, which there aren't any in this part of the state. I don't know what it was myself, and I guess it really doesn't matter. My son and I are alive, and mostly unharmed. I just hope that the next time, whatever that thing was, thinks twice before trying to prey. I'm a retired Army veteran, and when I first retired, I moved to a small town in La Frontera, a beautiful region along the Texas-Mexico border. I had wanted to live there for a long time and had done quite a bit of research on it and had visited several times. It's known for its rugged landscapes and rich cultural heritage, and I fell in love with it the first time I visited. Anytime it would get tough for me in the Army, I would think to myself, just keep pushing until La Frontera. I'm so grateful that I survived and can live out the rest of my days here as I have dreamed of my entire life. La Frontera is a very beautiful place. The locals are friendly, the markets are bustling, and have everything you could possibly ask for. The natural scenery is incredibly picturesque everywhere you look. I have always been an outdoorsman and enjoyed hiking, fishing, and hunting. La Frontera was the perfect place for me to indulge in these activities. Anytime I want, I can go explore the countryside, fish in the Rio Grande, and hunt game in the nearby mountains. It's my paradise. Several years ago, however, I had a near-death experience that changed me from a non-believer and total skeptic to an avid enthusiast of all things in the paranormal realm. I had just finished fishing and was lugging my cooler back to my truck when I heard this horrible hissing and screeching noise. I've heard my brothers in the army screaming in the heat of battle, but the sound this thing made was the worst thing I have ever heard. I spun around looking at the tree line where the hideous sound came from, but couldn't see anything. I had my hand on my holster, ready to use my gun if I needed to. I carefully scanned the area in front of me, but couldn't see anything. After a while, I slowly continued moving toward my truck. Some time passed, and I figured I was no longer in danger. My arm was also getting tired from holding the cooler, so I used both hands to haul it and made my way toward my truck. I threw the cooler in the back, and as I was heading toward the driver's side door, when I saw what looked like a large dog with glowing eyes and spikes along its back. It had big claws and fangs and was crouched in a pouncing position, like it was waiting for me. I slowly wrapped my hand around the handle of my gun and took cover behind the truck bed. I had heard stories about the chupacabra before, but I always thought it was a ridiculous urban legend. So many of the locals had told me stories of the chupacabra. Some said it killed their livestock. Some said it killed their dog. Some said it even kidnapped their children. And it seemed pretty much like everyone had a run-in with the chupacabra at some point. I always thought it was nonsense, but seeing it up close, it couldn't have been anything else. Suddenly, the creature ran towards me. I fired a shot, figuring the sound of the gun would scare it, but it jumped on me and immediately latched onto my arm. I fell to the ground, dropped my gun, and the beast was on top of me. I can still hear the sound of its hissing growl as it shook its head and ripped up my arm. I managed to grab my hunting knife and stab the beast in its neck. The creature let out another horrible screech and took off into the woods, taking my knife with it. I grabbed my gun, took off my shirt, and wrapped it around my arm. The thing seriously messed up my arm, and it was a gruesome sight. Had that thing bitten my shoulder, neck, or face, I probably wouldn't be alive to talk about it. I sped towards the nearest hospital and blacked out as soon as I got through the doors. The next thing I know, I woke up in a hospital room with bandages all over my arm. The doctor said I was very lucky to have survived such an attack, and he figured a bear bit me. When I told him it was a dog, he immediately, an educated doctor, said it must have been a chupacabra. It was surreal. The doctor then told me about how he had seen a chupacabra kill one of his parents' goats as a child. The creature he described sounded exactly like what had attacked me. I left the hospital, and after several months of rehabilitation, I was a changed man. I had always been very skeptical of anything that science hadn't deemed real, but it was obvious to me now that there was so much out there that we couldn't begin to understand. It made me think about all the near-death experiences I had in the army, and made me realize that it must have been God who had saved my life time and time again. I should have been dead 4 times, but something wasn't done with me, and it became obvious to me at that moment that I was put here on Earth for a reason. I began to research the chupacabra among other paranormal creatures that were said to roam in the surrounding area. It gave me a real sense of community to be able to share my own chupacabra experience with people. Anytime someone says there's no such thing as a chupacabra, I now just show them my arm scars and am usually met with silence. It's awesome. The doctors were amazed that I had survived such an attack. They had never seen anything like it before. They thought it might have been a rabid dog, but they had never heard of a dog with spikes on its back or glowing eyes. After several weeks of recovery, I left the hospital and went back to my home in La Frontera. I was a changed man. I had always been a skeptic, but now I knew that there were things in this world that were beyond our understanding. The spot where the chupacabra almost took my life is a spot that I frequent on a weekly basis now. I always go prepared, but I have yet to see him or even see a trace of him again. I can't say I hope to see him again, but at the same time, I feel like I have a deep connection with him. I am very grateful to the chupacabra for igniting my faith and spiritual awareness. God works in mysterious ways. My favorite thing in the world to do is go into an abandoned building and photograph them. There is something so beautiful to me about how a neglected place falls apart due to nothing but time. I can't explain it, but I've always been obsessed with it. And anytime I'm not working or sleeping, I'm exploring abandoned buildings and documenting my findings. When an animal dies, there is something so fascinating to me about how it decomposes over time. And it trips me out to think that one day we will all do the exact same thing. I think that exploring abandoned buildings is a way that I can look at death as a natural, beautiful thing instead of a disturbing, morbid thing. I think if we can come to terms with the fact that we will all die one day, we can make the most out of our life and not simply exist based on fear. There was this place in Poughkeepsie, New York, called the Hudson River State Hospital that I visited quite a few years back. It was an abandoned psychiatric hospital that had closed in the early 2000s. It was a notorious spot to do some exploring and was apparently very haunted. Naturally, this piqued my curiosity, and I planned on spending the whole day exploring and photographing this place. There were 3 main buildings I was particularly excited about visiting. The first one, you could see from the parking lot of a local strip mall, which is where I did most of my planning. It was called Ryan Hall, which was first opened in 1934, and is where the violent and criminally insane patients were held. The way the building is laid out is that it's constantly in the shadows of a much bigger building nearby, called the Cheney Building. I also planned on visiting the morgue, which had refrigerated cold chambers where they would hold the dead bodies, and the Herman B. Snow Rehabilitation Center. This building opened in 1971 and had 2 bowling alley lanes, an auditorium, a basketball court, an indoor swimming pool, and various other recreational activities for the patients to enjoy. I bet both places would look amazing, run down, and dilapidated. The morgue would have been so creepy, and the recreational building would have made such incredible art. To think it was once a place where criminally insane patients would find some solace from an otherwise disturbed and crazed existence. The pictures would have been amazing. I visited Ryan Hall first, and what I experienced there forced me to cut my trip short, and I never got the chance to explore any of the other buildings. They've mostly been demolished now, and I regret not returning. But what happened to me in Ryan Hall was the most terrifying experience I've ever had in my entire life. I was so excited planning it in my car and researching what other people had experienced in those buildings. Finally, I made my way across the strip mall's parking lot and headed towards Ryan Hall. As soon as I stepped onto the property, my excitement went away and something didn't feel right. It was like I was being watched by someone or something. I had spent so much time planning this day, so I tried to brush it off as my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I made my way across the parking lot, which was falling apart, and had grass and weeds growing through it. I got to the building, and it was just what I was hoping for. Creepy, dark, neglected, and the stale air hit you like a freight train. When you opened the door, the paint was chipping off the walls, the ceilings were exposed, the floor was in disarray, you name it. I got inside and started snapping some pictures. As I made my way through the building, I heard a faint whisper, which sounded like a woman's voice. I loudly asked if anybody else was there. I was half expecting to see more people exploring the inside of the facility, but nobody answered. I kept exploring and taking pictures, but I felt on edge. I got to this door that opened into a long hallway, and when I opened it, I was hit with cold air. It was the middle of summer, and this place hadn't had electricity for years. It freaked me out. I opened the door to a room that had a rickety old wheelchair sitting in the middle of it, and got a really creepy, incredible photo. I was looking at the picture I had taken when I heard these loud footsteps coming from a nearby room. It scared me, but I had to investigate the source of the footsteps. I opened the door where the footsteps came from, but it was empty. I was about to leave when I saw a shadow glide across the room. I froze, and then heard the whispering again. This time, it was a lot louder. It said, "Get out," right in my freaking ear, and I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, and there was nobody there. I sprinted out of the room and was trying to figure out where the exit was. I heard loud footsteps coming from behind me, and I screamed for help. Something shoved me to the ground, and as I turned to look, I saw a white, glowing apparition hovering above me. It eventually took the shape of a woman, and I was in shock and couldn't move. She looked me right in the eyes, and I had never been so scared in my life. I really thought I was going to die. Then she said, "Help me," and my instincts must have taken over. I sprinted out of there and took off towards my car as quickly as I possibly could. I got in my car and sped out of there and never looked back. My hands were bloody from catching myself on the ground after being shoved, and I started looking up stories of other people who had visited this place. I still photograph abandoned buildings all the time, but have never experienced anything close to what happened to me